final resting place of ancient Egyptian Queen Nefertiti could finally have been discovered thanks to advances in modern technology.
For more than 3,000 years, Queen Nefertiti has been nothing more than a beautiful face frozen in limestone, a silent icon, an eternal mystery, the most famous woman of the ancient world. Yet nobody knew where she was buried, nobody could find her body, and nobody understood what really happened to her. Until now. Modern science has finally done the unthinkable. Researchers have peered into the microscopic history hidden within ancient bone, extracting DNA from mummies that have baked in desert heat for over 3 millennia. And what they found is not just surprising, it's absolutely terrifying. We're talking about a legacy of biological devastation, secret chambers that might still be sealed, and a queen who may have been hiding in plain sight this entire time. Her face destroyed, her name erased, her memory deliberately obliterated by those who came after her. This is the story of how DNA evidence shattered everything we thought we knew about ancient Egypt's most mysterious queen. ACT1. The Golden Empire that vanished, 045 to 330. To understand why this DNA discovery is so shocking, you first need to understand the sheer magnitude of what was lost. We need to set the scene, because Nefertiti wasn't just a queen consort sitting quietly in a palace somewhere. She was a co-ruler, a goddess made flesh who stood shoulder to shoulder with her husband, Pharaoh Akhenaten. Together, they did something that had never been done before in the 3,000-year history of Egypt. They dismantled the old gods, fired the immensely powerful priesthood of Amun, and moved the entire capital city to a remote, hostile patch of desert called Amarna. This wasn't a minor reform. This was a complete religious revolution, and for a few fleeting years at the height of Egypt's imperial power, Akhenaten and Nefertiti were the absolute center of the universe. They lived in a golden city dedicated to the sun disk, the Aten. This wasn't your typical ancient metropolis built over generations. Amarna was constructed in a hurry, a pop-up city of white stone shimmering in the brutal desert heat. Art from this period shows them as a loving, intimate family, often depicted holding their 6 daughters, all of them basking under the rays of the sun god who offered them Ankh symbols, the hieroglyphic sign for life itself. It paints a picture of domestic perfection combined with absolute political power. They were the ultimate power couple, literally rewriting the rules of reality. But there's something deeply unsettling about the art from this era. If you look closely at the statues of Akhenaten and even some depictions of Nefertiti, they don't look quite human. They have elongated skulls that stretch backward unnaturally, distended bellies, wide hips on the male figures, spider-like fingers that seem impossibly thin and long. For decades, fringe theorists have gone absolutely wild with this, claiming this is definitive proof of ancient alien contact. They say Nefertiti and her husband were hybrids, visitors from the stars who came to teach humanity about monotheism and the one true light. While that sounds like pure science fiction, the reality hiding in their genes might actually be stranger than aliens. The Great Disappearance. Just as their power reached its absolute peak, the historical records stop cold. It's one of history's greatest vanishing acts. Around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti simply evaporates from the historical timeline. One day she's leading religious processions, depicted on temple walls smiting Egypt's enemies in scenes usually reserved for pharaohs. The next day, she's gone. There's no record of her death, no grand funeral procession described in any text, no tomb ever positively identified, and most suspiciously, no mummy that anyone could definitively point to and say, "That's her." For centuries, historians assumed she must have fallen out of favor with her husband. Perhaps she was exiled to a harem somewhere, living out her days in luxurious obscurity, or maybe she died from one of the plagues that periodically swept through the ancient world, killing rich and poor alike. But the complete lack of evidence has always felt intentional, like a crime scene that had been meticulously scrubbed clean. The temples they built were systematically dismantled stone by stone. Their names were violently chiseled out of walls across Egypt, and the city of Amarna itself was abandoned to the desert sands within a generation. It was as if someone had ordered the desert itself to swallow them whole. Here's what most people don't realize. The ancient Egyptians believed that if you spoke a dead person's name, you kept them alive in the afterlife. They thought the Ka, the life force, could be sustained through memory and utterance. Conversely, to destroy a name, to physically hack it out of stone with a chisel, was to destroy the soul for all eternity. It was considered a fate genuinely worse than death. It meant total oblivion, an eternal second death from which there could be no return. Someone wanted Nefertiti gone, not just from the earth, but from eternity itself. They wanted to make absolutely certain she could never navigate the treacherous underworld, never pass the judgment of Osiris, never reach the field of reeds where the blessed dead lived forever. This wasn't just murder, this was spiritual annihilation. ACT 2. The Nameless Bodies, 3:30 to 7 o'clock. For decades after the initial discoveries, archaeologists sifted through the sands of the Valley of the Kings, desperate for any clue. A cartouche, a piece of jewelry with her name, a bone fragment with royal markings, anything. They found plenty of mummies, certainly. The valley was packed with them, some royal, many not, but the great royal wife, the woman whose face launched a million museum visits, remained an absolute ghost. She was the most famous woman in the ancient world, yet she was nowhere to be found. The mystery of her disappearance became something of a holy grail within Egyptology, a puzzle with pieces that seemed permanently lost to history. Until science finally caught up. Tomb KV-21, The Forgotten Queens. In 1817, a strongman and explorer named Giovanni Belzoni was excavating in the Valley of the Kings. Belzoni was a colorful character, a former circus performer turned archaeologist who was primarily looking for spectacular finds, gold, grand statues, the kind of shiny treasures that would impress his European patrons. What he found in Tomb KV-21 was, to him, a profound disappointment, but to modern genetics, it would prove to be a goldmine. Inside the small, undecorated tomb, Belzoni found two female mummies. They had been completely stripped of their wrappings by ancient tomb robbers. Their jewelry was gone. They had been left to deteriorate in the darkness for over 3,000 years. They were nameless. Some early reports even suggested they were headless. Though this turned out to be exaggerated, what was certain is that they were in terrible condition. For a long time, nobody paid them much attention. They were catalogued, studied briefly, and then largely forgotten. One of them had her arms crossed over her chest in what's known as the Queen's pose, a specific burial posture strictly reserved for royal women of the highest status. But without inscriptions, without a name, she was just another anonymous body, just debris left over from an ancient tomb robbery. Or so everyone thought. One of these mummies, carefully catalogued as KV-21b, would eventually become a focal point of the modern investigation into Nefertiti's fate. The younger lady, a face of agony. But there was another discovery, one that would prove even more critical to solving this ancient mystery. In 1898, French Egyptologist Victor Loret made one of the most spectacular archaeological finds of the 19th century. He opened the sealed walls of Tomb KV-35, the original burial place of the pharaoh Amenhotep II. It was massive. The tomb had been repurposed centuries after Amenhotep's death as a cache, a hiding place where priests of the 21st dynasty had secreted away multiple royal mummies to protect them from the tomb robbers who were systematically plundering the Valley of the Kings. Imagine walking into a dark chamber, the air thick with dust that hasn't been disturbed in thousands of years, and seeing pile after pile of Egypt's greatest kings lying before you. But amongst the great pharaohs wrapped in their finest linens, there were three bodies that didn't fit the pattern. They were dumped unceremoniously in a small side chamber. A young boy, an older woman, and a younger woman. The younger woman, known simply as the younger lady in archaeological records, was a tragic and horrifying sight. She had been brutally damaged. Her chest was smashed inward. Her right arm was completely missing, torn from the socket, and there was a gaping, nightmarish hole in her face where her mouth and jaw used to be. It looked like a scream frozen in dried flesh and bone. For over a century, she was a museum curiosity, a mummy with no name and a face of eternal agony. People walked past her display case in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, completely unaware they might be looking directly at the most powerful woman of the 18th dynasty. It wasn't until 2010 that researchers decided to look closer, not with their eyes this time, but with the most advanced genetic technology available. ACT3. The DNA bombshell, 7 o'clock to 11 o'clock. Here's the crazy part. When the scientific team first proposed extracting DNA from these ancient mummies, they weren't even looking for Nefertiti. That wasn't the original goal at all. They were trying to build the family tree of King Tutankhamun, the boy king whose tomb had captivated the world when it was discovered in 1922. Researchers wanted to know who his parents actually were, because the historical records from this period were incredibly muddled. The Amarna period is essentially a black hole in Egyptian records. That's because the pharaohs who came after, rulers like Horemheb and the Ramesses kings, deliberately tried to erase it from history. They saw Akhenaten's religious revolution as heresy, a stain on Egypt's legacy that needed to be scrubbed away. So the scientists had to go directly to the source, to the bones themselves. The extraction process. The technical challenges were enormous. DNA degrades over time, breaking down into smaller and smaller fragments. Heat accelerates this process dramatically, and the mummies in question had been sitting in the desert heat for over 3,300 years. On top of that, the ancient Egyptian embalming process was specifically designed to preserve flesh, but it's absolutely terrible for DNA preservation. The embalmers used hot resins, natron salts, and various other chemicals that corrupt genetic material. The research team, led by Egyptian archaeologist Drive, Zahi Hawass and geneticist Drive, Karsten Pusch, used micro drills to carefully extract samples from the bone marrow deep within the ancient femurs. Bone marrow, protected within the dense shaft of the thigh bone, was their best hope for finding intact DNA. They extracted both mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through the mother's line and is more abundant in cells, and nuclear DNA, which contains the full genetic code from both parents but is much more difficult to recover from ancient samples. The samples were sent to multiple independent laboratories to avoid contamination and confirm results. Then came months of painstaking computer analysis, reading millions of genetic fragments and searching for the unique markers that would reveal family relationships. The shocking results. When the results finally came back from the lab, they sent absolute shockwaves through the archaeological community. The DNA proved conclusively that the younger lady from tomb KV35 was not just some random concubine or minor royal wife. She was the biological mother of King Tutankhamun himself. But the revelation didn't stop there. The genetic analysis went further. She was also the full sister of the mummy found in tomb KV55. Same mother, same father, a sibling pair. Now pause for a second and let that sink in. The mummy in KV55 is almost certainly Akhenaten. The genetics match Tutankhamun as his father. The age at death matches. The tomb contained items specifically belonging to him. The evidence is overwhelming. So if the younger lady is Tutankhamun's mother, and she's also Akhenaten's full sister, then we have a massive problem. Because history records Nefertiti as Akhenaten's wife, but she was never described as his sister. Traditional texts identify Nefertiti as likely being the daughter of a high-ranking court official named I, who would later become pharaoh himself. She was supposed to be of non-royal birth, elevated to queen through marriage. This creates a huge contradiction. Was the younger lady actually Nefertiti, and history simply got her lineage completely wrong? It wouldn't be the first time ancient propaganda misled us. Royal families routinely rewrote their own histories to suit political needs. Or was she someone else entirely? A shadow queen whose name has been completely lost to history? The alternative theories. Some theories suggest the younger lady could be a secondary wife named Kia, who appears briefly in Amarna records before disappearing. Others propose she might have been one of Akhenaten's own daughters, whom he married in a twisted attempt to keep the bloodline pure and maintain the divine essence of kingship. This kind of father-daughter incest was rare but not unheard of in Egyptian royal families, particularly during times of dynastic crisis. But here's what makes many researchers believe the younger lady actually is Nefertiti, despite the genealogical confusion. Facial reconstruction experts have analyzed the skull structure of the younger lady and compared it to the famous limestone bust of Nefertiti that sits in the Berlin Museum. The resemblance is striking and haunting. The high cheekbones, the distinctive jawline, the spacing of the eyes and the shape of the brow. The proportions match almost exactly. Is it possible that the DNA is telling us a truth we're simply afraid to accept? That Nefertiti was actually Akhenaten's sister all along, making their union even more genetically catastrophic than anyone previously imagined? That their entire bloodline was doomed from the very start? ACT4. The Genetic Horror Story, 11 o'clock to 1500. The DNA analysis didn't just potentially identify Nefertiti. It gave researchers something far more disturbing. A medical chart that reads like a biological horror story. When scientists fully mapped the genome of the Amarna royal family, they found something terrifying. a distinct and devastating lack of genetic diversity. The ancient Egyptian royals were absolutely obsessed with keeping their bloodline pure. This wasn't just tradition or snobbery, it was theology. The gods themselves practiced sibling marriage in Egyptian mythology. Isis and Osiris were brother and sister, and together they produced Horus. The pharaohs wanted to emulate this divine perfection. They genuinely believed their blood carried divine essence, literal solar power flowing through mortal veins. Mixing that sacred blood with commoners, they thought, would dilute the magic and weaken Egypt itself. But biology doesn't care about royal titles or religious dogma. Biology punishes lack of diversity with brutal efficiency. The accumulation of genetic defects. The genetic profile of Tutankhamun and his mother, the younger lady, showed a massive accumulation of harmful recessive genes. We're talking about severe skeletal deformities, club feet that made walking agonizing, scoliosis that twisted the spine, and immune systems that were practically non-existent, leaving them vulnerable to every infection and disease. The entire family was walking on biological eggshells. They were fragile, chronically ill, and living on borrowed time. CT scans of the younger lady revealed that she likely suffered from a condition that made her bones incredibly brittle, almost like advanced osteoporosis in a young woman. The slightest trauma would cause catastrophic fractures. But there's an even wilder theory here that links directly back to those strange, alien-looking statues from Amarna. Some geneticists have suggested the family suffered from Marfan syndrome, a connective tissue disorder that causes elongated limbs, fingers, and distinctive facial features. Others point to Antley-Bixler syndrome, which causes premature fusion of skull bones and characteristic cranial deformities. This would explain why Akhenaten looked so bizarre in his official portraits. He wasn't an alien from another world, he was a walking collection of genetic errors, the biological price of generations of deliberate inbreeding. And if Nefertiti was indeed his sister, she carried the exact same genetic time bomb in every cell of her body. The violence reconsidered. This genetic context changes absolutely everything about the violence found on the younger lady's body. The massive wound to her face, which shattered her jaw and drove teeth fragments into her throat, was originally thought to be the casual work of tomb robbers digging for gold amulets hidden in the mummy wrappings. Ancient tomb robbers were notoriously brutal. They would rip heads completely off corpses to get at valuable necklaces. They'd hack through chest cavities with axes looking for scarab amulets placed over the heart. To them, these weren't sacred ancestors. They were just obstacles to treasure. But modern forensic analysis tells a different story. Dr. Zahi Hawass and forensic experts who examined the wound in detail noted something disturbing. The CT scans show specific characteristics that differ from typical postmortem damage. There are subtle signs that might indicate bone reaction, possibly even early hematoma formation, suggesting the trauma occurred right around the time of death. If this mummy truly is Nefertiti, she absolutely did not die peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by priests chanting protective spells. That blow to the face would have been instantly fatal. It suggests she was struck with tremendous force by a heavy blunt object, possibly a ceremonial mace or war axe. And given the fragile nature of her bones revealed by DNA analysis, such a blow would have been utterly catastrophic. Her skull, already weakened by genetic defects, would have shattered like pottery. It paints a picture of a violent end, an assassination, perhaps, a murder carried out with rage and purpose. ACT 5. The political context, 1500 to 1800. Let's get speculative for a moment and consider the political climate when Nefertiti disappeared. Akhenaten's religious revolution had been an absolute disaster for Egypt. He had destroyed the traditional economy by defunding the temples, which weren't just religious centers but also functioned as banks, hospitals, and social services. He'd alienated the powerful military by focusing on religious art instead of defending Egypt's imperial territories. Foreign vassals were writing desperate letters begging for military support while enemy kingdoms chipped away at Egyptian holdings. The famous Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence discovered at the site, paint a picture of an empire in crisis while its pharaoh obsessed over theology. The common people were suffering, the elite were furious, and the priests of Amun, who had lost everything, were waiting for their moment of revenge. When Akhenaten died, Nefertiti was left holding the bag. All the rage that had been building during her husband's reign would have focused on her. The theory of assassination. Did the priests of Amun, eager to restore their power and wealth, corner the queen in her palace? Did a general, perhaps the future pharaoh Hormheb, decide that the only way to save Egypt from complete collapse was to silence the heretic queen forever? The symbolism of the smashed face is particularly chilling when you understand Egyptian funerary beliefs. In ancient Egypt, you needed your mouth to speak the magical spells that would help you navigate the afterlife. The mouth was ritually opened in the final funeral ceremony so the deceased could eat, drink, and speak in the realm of the dead. Smashing the mouth was a deliberate act to ensure the victim could never speak to the gods again, could never defend themselves at the judgment before Osiris, could never recite the spells from the Book of the Dead that would grant passage to eternal life. It was spiritual murder added to physical murder. The doomed bloodline. But here's where the DNA evidence becomes truly haunting. It's not just about the violence Nefertiti may have suffered, it's about the legacy she passed on, the biological inheritance that doomed everyone who came after. The DNA analysis of the two tiny fetuses found in Tutankhamun's tomb, his stillborn daughters, shows the absolute end of the line. They carried so many compounding genetic errors, passed down from Akhenaten and his sister wife, then from Tutankhamun to his own wife Ankhesenamun, who was also his half-sister. That survival was biologically impossible. One infant was born at about 5 months gestation, far too premature to survive with ancient medical knowledge. The other reached nearly full term but had such severe spinal and skeletal deformities that death was certain. The Amarna bloodline didn't just end, it collapsed completely under the weight of its own biological failure. There's even a wild theory that the plague mentioned in texts from this period wasn't just a normal epidemic. Some researchers speculate that the royal family's incestuous practices made them patient zero for a specific genetic vulnerability. Their compromised immune systems, weakened by inbreeding, made them catastrophically susceptible to certain diseases. They may have been the first recorded instance of a biologically amplified plague wiping out an entire dynasty from within. If the mummy known as KV21b is indeed Nefertiti, her DNA links her directly to this tragic cycle of deformity, disease, and death. She wasn't just a ruler, she was a victim of the very traditions she upheld, the very beliefs that made her divine. ACT 6. The Female Pharaoh Theory, 1800 to 2130. But wait, there's a significant twist in the timeline that makes this mystery even more complex. What if Nefertiti didn't die in year 12 of Akhenaten's reign? What if she actually survived him and ruled Egypt herself? Before Tutankhamun took the throne as a child of about 9 years old, there was a shadowy pharaoh who ruled for a very brief period. Historical records refer to this ruler as Smenkhkare or Neferneferuaten, depending on which inscriptions you're reading. For decades, scholars automatically assumed this must have been a man, perhaps a brother of Akhenaten, or maybe a son from a minor wife. But the evidence is starting to point in a completely different direction. The clues to female kingship. What if Smenkhkare wasn't a man at all? The theory goes that Nefertiti didn't simply disappear. Instead, she elevated herself to the status of co-regent during Akhenaten's final years, taking on new throne names. After his death, she ruled as a full pharaoh in her own right, just as Hatshepsut had done generations earlier. There are clues scattered all over if you know where to look. Inscriptions show a figure wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the ultimate symbol of pharaonic power. But this figure has distinctly feminine body proportions visible beneath the royal regalia, the wider hips, the body shape that no male pharaoh would be depicted with. Even more intriguing, some of the burial equipment found in Tutankhamun's tomb shows clear signs of being reworked. Names were scratched out and hastily replaced. Inscriptions were altered. Feminine grammatical markers were changed to masculine ones. The most famous example is Tutankhamun's iconic gold death mask itself. Art historians have long been fascinated by its appearance because it looks distinctly feminine compared to typical pharaonic masks. It has pierced ears, which male kings didn't typically have on their death masks. The facial features are soft, almost androgynous. The mask looks remarkably similar to the famous bust of Nefertiti. Did Tutankhamun literally inherit his stepmother's burial equipment because she died suddenly? Or was it repurposed because her memory was being systematically erased and recycled was more cost-effective than creating everything new? Why a female pharaoh had to be erased? The theory suggests that Nefertiti ruled as a king to hold the empire together while Tutankhamun was still a child, too young to rule effectively. To command the respect of generals and administrators in that deeply patriarchal society, she would have had to present herself as masculine, wear the false beard, use male titles and pronouns. But this gender-bending rule would have been the final outrage for traditionalists already furious about the Amarna heresy. A woman acting as a man, worshipping a sun disk instead of the ancient gods, ignoring the priests of Amun, maintaining the hated policies of Akhenaten. It was too much. If Nefertiti did become a female pharaoh, it perfectly explains why her tomb has never been found in the expected locations. Kings were buried in the Valley of the Kings, following a specific male royal protocol. Queens had their own separate valley and different burial traditions. It also explains the systematic erasure of her memory. When the old religious order was finally restored, the priests wouldn't just want to wipe out a heretic queen. They would want to eliminate the double heresy of a woman who dared act like a man and claim full pharaonic power. The Hittite letters. This theory aligns eerily well with one of ancient history's most fascinating documents. In the archives of the Hittite Empire, Egypt's primary rival to the north, archaeologists discovered a series of desperate letters from an Egyptian queen. She identifies herself only as Dekamanzu, which scholars believe simply means the king's wife in Egyptian. This queen wrote to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma with an extraordinary request. She said, "My husband is dead and I have no son. Send me one of your sons and he will be my husband and rule as king of Egypt." She added urgently, "I am afraid I will never take one of my subjects as a husband." Think about how desperate this sounds. This wasn't a woman confident in her power. This was someone surrounded by enemies. Someone who knew the walls were closing in. Many historians believe this was Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's widow, after his unexpected death, but others argue it could have been Nefertiti herself, realizing that without strong foreign backing, the traditional powers in Egypt would destroy her. She was trying to pull off a geopolitical Hail Mary, attempting to unite Egypt and the Hittite Empire through a marriage alliance that would have utterly transformed the ancient world. The Hittite king was deeply suspicious. The letter seemed too good to be true. He sent envoys to verify the situation. Finally, convinced of its authenticity, he dispatched his son Prince Zenanza to Egypt to marry the desperate queen and become pharaoh. But Prince Zenanza never arrived. He was murdered at the Egyptian border, almost certainly on orders from someone within the Egyptian court who saw this foreign marriage as an unacceptable threat to their own ambitions. This was the smoking gun evidence of a coup in progress. A powerful figure in the Egyptian government, quite possibly the Vizier I, who would shortly afterward crown himself pharaoh, had the Hittite prince assassinated. The marriage alliance died with him, and so likely did the queen's hopes of survival. If this powerful faction was willing to kill a foreign prince and risk war with the Hittite Empire, what would they do to Nefertiti herself? The theory suggests she was eliminated shortly afterward, her face smashed in an act of rage and political necessity, her body dumped without honor in a hidden cache tomb, stripped of identifying marks, meant to be forgotten forever. Conclusion. The unanswered questions, 2130 to 2300. So where does all this evidence leave us? The mummies in tombs KV35 and KV21 offer tantalizing DNA clues that have revolutionized our understanding of the Amarna period. But frustratingly, we still don't have the definitive smoking gun that would let us point to one specific mummy and say with absolute certainty, that is Nefertiti. We have bodies that could be her. We have DNA that links to her children. We have violence that suggests assassination. But we don't yet have final proof. The most controversial theory in modern Egyptology, one that could literally change history books tomorrow if proven true, revolves around a hidden chamber. In 2015, British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves studied high-resolution laser scans of Tutankhamun's burial chamber and noticed something extraordinary. Faint linear traces beneath the painted plaster, lines that looked suspiciously like the outline of a doorway that had been plastered over and disguised. His theory is as simple as it is mind-blowing. He believes that Tutankhamun's tomb is actually just the antechamber of a much larger tomb, the tomb of Nefertiti herself. When Tutankhamun died unexpectedly at 19, Egypt was still in chaos. The treasury was depleted from Akhenaten's building projects. They didn't have a proper royal tomb ready, so according to Reeves, they cracked open his stepmother Nefertiti's tomb, sealed off her burial chamber with a hasty wall, painted murals over it to hide the modification, and buried the boy king in what was essentially her entrance hallway. Think about the implications. Tutankhamun's tomb was famously tiny for a pharaoh, crammed with more than 5,000 objects in a space that seemed inadequate. It has an L-shaped layout, which was typically reserved for queens, not kings. If Reeves is correct, Nefertiti is sleeping just inches away from where millions of tourists have stood over the past century, completely unaware. Ground-penetrating radar scans have been conducted multiple times with contradictory results. Some readings showed promising voids behind the walls. Others detected nothing unusual. The debate has become heated, with technology, politics, and egos all tangled together. The Egyptian government has so far refused to authorize drilling or physical investigation, unwilling to risk damaging the priceless painted walls of Tutankhamun's chamber for what might turn out to be nothing. But imagine if Nefertiti really is behind that wall. If she's sitting in a completely undisturbed royal burial, she would represent the archaeological discovery of the century. Tutankhamun's tomb, already robbed twice in antiquity before being sealed, contained unimaginable wealth, and Tutankhamun was a minor king who ruled for less than a decade. Nefertiti was a major ruler at the absolute height of Egypt's wealth and power. Her tomb would contain art, texts, and treasures that would make Tutankhamun's hoard look like pocket change by comparison. More importantly, it would contain answers, inscriptions explaining what really happened, why she disappeared, how she died, what her true relationship was to the royal family. But for now, she remains elusive, the most famous woman of the ancient world, still hiding, still silent, still keeping her secrets after more than 3,000 years. The DNA has stripped away the romantic legends. It's replaced the pristine limestone perfection of her famous bust with the brutal reality of human frailty, genetic catastrophe, and political violence. We used to look at the Amarna period as a time of beautiful revolutionary art and enlightened sun worship. Now, thanks to genetics, we see it as a desperate time of inbreeding, epidemic disease, and ruthless power struggles. Nefertiti wasn't just a beauty queen posing for sculptors. She was a survivor navigating a genetic and political nightmare, fighting to maintain power in a world that wanted her erased. Until her luck finally ran out. Do you think the battered mummy of the younger lady is really the lost Queen Nefertiti? Or is her true tomb still waiting to be opened, sealed behind the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, just waiting for us to finally break through and reveal her secrets? Let us know what you think in the comments below.